Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm J.M. Frey and we are reading the Skylark song. In this video, chapter 2. Last month, the windows at the front of Robin's house had been blown out by a bomb. It had been dropped right onto the cobblestone street with no regard for the dilapidated row homes on either side. It was by no means the first bomb to go off in a residential area, but it was the first in Robin's neighborhood, close as they were to the factory fields at the edge of the city. The Klonn usually saved their ammunition for the bigger targets if they were this far out. Not that night, though. The brittle crunch of brick under metal had given her about a second's warning before the flat crack of the explosion itself, followed by the reverberating whump of the shockwave, and had sent her window flying inward in fragments so small she would have been blinded by the glass dust if she had been standing nearby. She tried not to think about what had happened to the neighbors who had been stupid enough to watch the sky that night. Didn't mean the nightmares didn't still come when she had no work to distract her, though. Terrible visions of burned hands, or stumps where those hands should have been, haunted her in the darkness. Images of blood running from eyes, of mangled faces and limbs, danced in the shadows of sleep, and under it all, the horror of being rendered useless, of being unable to work, of becoming a ground-bound burden. She'd been asleep when it fell, time-eaten curtains drawn tight across the pane, held in place with clothespins in the event this very thing happened. The glass that had smashed inward had been mostly caught by the fabric. The pieces that were big enough to break free had fallen in a waterfall, radiating out across the floor. Robin had been curled up on her lumpy old mattress in the closet. She hadn't slept in the room's actual bed in years. It was too dangerous. Luckily, Robin's boots were in the closet with her, and she hadn't needed to navigate the floors barefoot. By the time Robin had gotten home from work the next day, her mother had swept up the dust and shards and had set them aside to sell back to the glassmaker. Anything that could be reused or remade was kept. Her father had scavenged a thin sheet of splintering wood to nail across the frame, and he scrounged some rags from the fallen houses nearby and had stuffed wads of the fabric into the gaping holes in the board. Robin could see the ragged edges of those fabric wads fluttering in the early autumn breeze as she hovered under a guttering street lamp a block away, peering through the haze. Her stomach unwound at the familiarity of it. It was the same sense of relief she felt each time a skirmish ended, and Wade turned their glider back towards the safety of the hangar. While she hadn't lied to Al when she said the shipyards were more home to her now than the building before her was, it didn't mean she wasn't still happy to see it standing at the end of each workday, and the finish of every nightly strafing. She stalled, working the toe of her right boot into the ashy debris of the cobblestones, her satchel slung over her shoulder and her face smarting. The sun was weak and watery today, lost in the haze of brick dust and the smoke that blew in off the factory fields. The fires from last night's bombings must still have been going to turn the late-night sky so sooty dark. The lamplighter hadn't even bothered to make his rounds that day. If he'd even survived the bombing at all, that is. The smoke stung her eyes, but Robin's goggles, hung around her neck while she was on the ground, wouldn't be much use down here. They were reflective, amber-tinted, meant for intense sunlight. They would leave her blind under the cover of so much ash. And the roads had heaved again. She didn't trust that her muscle memory would lead her home safe now. Around her, the close houses leaned against each other in the shadows. They looked like weary soldiers who'd just returned from the front. Square-toothed maws gapped from partially collapsed walls. Lightning bolt cracks zigzagged from roof to foundation. But despite that, the familiar sense of her childhood neighborhood reached out to envelop her, to welcome her back. Brick dust, wet stone, boiled vegetables, honey, and gunpowder. Robin tried to remember the last time her house had looked welcoming. She had vague memories of the small walled back garden brimming with wild flowers and her mama's hive. And she still heard echoes of her papa's tales, growing up on his parents' wagon, feast days filled with bright bunting streamers and visits from the wise women. Now everything was hard and scrabbly and dark. Her family was lucky, though. The homes of their relatives still stood. No extra families needed to crowd into their space. Yet. Robin's father was still employed as a postal carrier. News and letters had to bandy to and from the front lines. Her mother still found work as a seamstress and laundress, patching and repairing clothing and uniforms. And together with Robin's pay from the air patrol, they brought in 3 separate incomes. 3 incomes kept them afloat and fed, and though it couldn't replace the street-facing windows, which would have been a spectacularly dumb idea anyway, as the next bomb would likely do to the new glass what it had done to the old, their income was enough to keep them all clothed and bought enough coal to keep the skinny, spindly house warm. It even allowed them to help their neighbors do the same when there was little enough to spare. She didn't mind coming back here, but to be doing so before lunchtime was humiliating. Sent home without pay. Suspended for the rest of the day. And for what? For walloping a kid who'd hit her first? Unfair. If Fran had been a Seelie, they wouldn't have even bothered to run her in and mark up her files. They would have just let them beat each other and then get on with their work bloody and bruised and okay. No point in delaying the inevitable, Robin thought morosely as she fished her key out of her shirt, pulling it from where it was tied to a button with a piece of string. Her stomach gurgled at her. Not if I have any hope of lunch, anyway. She unlocked the door and pressed down on the knob as she opened it to keep the hinges from squealing. She placed the satchel beside the wall and then closed the door with the same caution. She locked it, threw the deadbolts, and turned, hardly daring to breathe. The hall was empty. Thank the gods for that, too, then. She sagged against the wall for a moment, rubbing her aching shoulder. Honestly, after the early morning scavenge and the brawl in the canteen, it would be nice to get an afternoon off. It would almost be like a vacation, even if it was without pay. Maybe I'll be lucky and Papa will be out on a special mission of his own, she thought. Surely someone has to schlep the maps of that new front from base to base. The thought of it lightened her mood, and she swung down to retrieve her satchel and head into the parlor. The parlor that, it turned out, was not empty. Papa stood by the fireplace, arms folded across his thin chest. His bushy black mustache quivered in anger, and his brown skin was flushed along his cheeks. Frozen in the doorway, Robin straightened, gave up all pretense of being quiet, and marched inside. Her mother stood by the good sofa, the one reserved for her clients when they came for her expert needle. Once it had been the height of Benet fashion. Now it was for visible patches and subtle repairs on uniforms. Or that's what they had come for, until her loom broke. It had been shattered so badly by the bomb that had taken the windows that it had barely been useful as kindling. Without a loom, Mama couldn't pull apart and reweave old curtains and torn garments into trimmings, patches, and smart little coats for the children of her clientele. Mama watched warily, gaze on Robin's rapidly blackening eye, as Robin stopped to withdraw her second prize from the satchel. Playing the footpad had paid off. Mama was thin and gray, her skin far paler than the average sienna of most Seelies, because so much of her work kept her indoors and out of the sun. Her curled shoulders sagged with cold and were worn round from a lifetime over a needle. Her limpid hair was doing its best to mimic ivy, curling around its braid in escaping and reaching tendrils, and her eyes were puffed with the need to sleep. But in Robin's mind, Mama was still the fresh, straight-backed, pretty woman with the ready smile, bronze complexion, and curling brown hair that she saw in the single precious tintype on the mantel. Robin didn't dare look at Papa as she held the wrapped item aloft and carefully removed the fabric that kept it from view. She had wrapped the tabletop factory-issue loom in yards and yards of the burlap that had been abandoned beside it, protecting it like a precious treasure until she could bestow it upon its new mistress. She found both in the cinders of what had been a textile mill. The roof and upper floors had been gone, but the walls had been intact, and the locks on the doors were still solid. She'd had to pick them just to get inside, a place that was still half on fire, irony be damned. The fabric reeked of stale smoke, but Robin knew that could wash out. "What do you think, Mama?" she asked, pride filling the spaces that had been left behind by her scanty breakfast. Mama carefully took the loom from her grasp. It's just like your old one. When I pulled it out, the embers were still hot. The whole thing must have gone up like a God's Day rocket. Lucky it was still in one piece, eh? And the burlap, I bet you could fetch a good price at market. Mama plunked down on the sofa, stroking the frame of the loom she cradled timidly. Oh, little birdie, you shouldn't have. This was a bad idea. Joy turned cold, shattered against the sharp edges of her rib cage. Shouldn't have, Robin spluttered, taking a step away. Birdie? I contribute to this household. Don't call me a baby. Papa made a disgusted sound. He stepped forward, ran his fingers over the embossed seal on the foot of the loom, the one that marked the factory that it had come from. They'll be able to trace that. So don't show it to anybody. Stand it off. Cover the loom when you have clients over, Robin snapped. You're welcome, by the way. For going out in the middle of the night and risking arrest? You could have been maimed for theft, Mama snapped back, setting aside the loom and rising to her feet, her hands fisting in the sides of her threadbare skirts. Robin rocked back on her heels for a brief silent second. She was dumbstruck. Mama was almost never angry and hardly ever raised her voice. Then the bitterness surged back. For bringing you what you need to start working again? I suppose I shouldn't have bothered then, should I? She whipped off her cap and threw it against the wall. A long sparrow brown braid tumbled down her back. Maybe I should have just go put on a skirt and bat my eyelashes at the next unmarried slob who stumbles by. Maybe I should get hitched and pop out a few screaming brats I wouldn't be able to afford to feed. It would be a God's damn sight better than never knowing where you are, never knowing whether or not you're even alive, Papa bellowed. Caught flat-footed by his volume, Robin's retort jammed up behind her tongue. She blinked hard twice and turned her back to her parents, clutching at her sleeves. Robin, darling, Mama called, but Robin didn't uncurl. It's just that you're still just a child. You're still our child. We can't help but worry about you. I thought I was old enough to be sold off to the next man Papa approves of, Robin sneered. Oh, my birdie, she breathed. You know that... She stopped herself, swallowing tremulously, her work-worn hands trembling in her skirts. I can burn it if you don't want it, Robin muttered, petulant. No! Her mother's hands shot up, her eyes the dark, rich amber of fresh honey, same as Robin's eyes, widening. No, that would be... There's no point now that the crime is done. She brushed the ill luck off her shoulders, even as she said it. Robin, Papa said, why are you home early? And what's happened to your face? I gave better than I got, she grunted at him. A bene? So? Papa rubbed the middle of his forehead with his thumb. He only had one. He'd been a more desperate man before he'd married Mama and settled down, before he'd gotten the job running letters. You can't pick fights with them, Robin. You don't know what it was like. When you were a boy and they took us in off the wagons for nothing because the sickness was killing everyone, and then there was a war and our people were trapped in brick houses with beehives on the roofs, and it's nice to have security and predictability, and I've heard it, Papa. Then why don't you listen to it? Sick to the teeth, Robin snarled to herself. She was hungry. She was angry. She was ashamed to have been sent home, and she was just so tired all the time. She just wanted the war to stop long enough for her to sleep. Instead of answering, Robin pulled a jackknife from the lip of her boot and cut a strip about a handspan wide off the end of the burlap sheet. It wasn't much, but perhaps the gods of luck would appreciate her offering up something of value. That was the point of a sacrifice at all. After all, Robin considered and then cut a second strip for the gods of fools as well, just to be sure. She stuffed the knife back into her boot sheath and the fabric into her pocket. Only then did she turn to face Papa. Refusing to be intimidated into guilt, Robin crossed her own tired arms across her own chest, mimicking Papa's stance. The kind of anger that pulled at his mouth had once inspired awe and fear in little Robin, but now she was nearly as tall as he was, and, like Al, her arms were just as corded with muscle as his. She deliberately turned her back to him and headed towards the door. "We're not through here," Papa began, butting in front of her, but Robin held out a hand to stop him. This wasn't a fight that was going to be won today, so she'd rather not continue it. "Is there any lunch left?" She brushed past him, returning to the hallway and crossing through into the kitchen. There was a cloth bundle on the table, and when Robin untied the knot, she found a small slice of cheese, a crusty bun, and a bit of stew in a clay pot. It smelled wonderful, especially after the chill of the autumn air and the acrid stench of soot and machine oil that filled the streets outside. She sat on the stool by the hearth and lifted the pot to her lips. It was cold, filled with pepper and the sharp, bright tang of fish. She set it down as close to the warming embers in the hearth as she could and turned her attention to the bread. The thick discomfort that had cramped her stomach eased with each nibble of cheese she took. She went slowly to make it last. "You didn't even come home before you went to the yard," Papa barked, following her into the kitchen and trying to pull her attention away from the food. "Can't you just be happy that I went out for Mama?" Robin said, careful not to slam the pot against the scratched wooden table, no matter how frustrated she was. "Just me, Bertie?" Mama asked, following them into the kitchen. She was folding the burlap as she walked, carefully measuring out the yardage. "And some stuff for Wade's glider," Robin admitted. "Surely there must be another way," Papa insisted. She looked up and deliberately stuffed the last of the bun into her mouth, puffing out her cheeks in a show to prove that she couldn't answer. She stood and brushed the crumbs off her pants. Papa was still in the doorway, as if uncertain whether or not he wished to block it and try to force her to listen to commands they both knew she was just going to ignore, or whether he wished to step inside and save them both the headache. Apparently having chosen to err on the side of paternal consternation, he raised his right hand and waggled his remaining thumb at her meaningfully. "There's nothing left in Pyrea to requisition," Robin snarled with all the defiance she could muster. Papa blinked, swallowing back the rest of whatever he'd planned to say. Sometimes he was so subservient that the right tone of haughty indifference could shut him up. It made Robin's gorge rise and twist with anger. Papa was just such a damn Sealy. "So I do the same goddamn thing that every other rutting mid-flight sergeant does in the dead of night to get their glider in the air, and somehow I'm in the wrong? It's as easy as that. I just damn well do it." "Robin, Bertie," Mama tried. She'd pulled a cool bottle of milk from the pantry and was laying the glass against the side of Robin's bruised temple. Robin brushed her away with a frustrated gesture. "We just don't like—" "So don't like it!" Robin didn't deny the urge to roll her eyes this time, nor to throw up her hands in frustration. "It won't stop me from going." Papa glowered and then, apparently, decided to try a different tack. "I read in the newspaper today that the Coyote—" Papa stopped, clicked his teeth shut, screwed his eyes closed. It was the same sound and expression that Al had made, the same expression all Sealies made whenever the Coyote was mentioned. "So what?" Robin hollered. "You want me to quit the air patrol because I might die? Maybe you should stop carrying the post because a rock might fall from a cloud and crack your skull. Papa, I am needed. Why do I have to keep proving this to everyone? Why does no one ever believe me?" "Bertie, you're still our child." Robin pulled herself upright. "Either I am a child who must be kept home, or I am a woman old enough to marry, which means old enough to make her own choices," Robin challenged. "So which is it?" "Not old enough to tell the difference between stealing and—" her father began, but Robin cut him off with a growling sound of indignation. "Stealing!" she echoed. "And what the hell does that Benny proprietor care? He's probably insured the whole building and is getting paid right now for his losses, probably for the people who died in there too." For there had been horrors in that rubble, things that Robin had refused to look at, to not go near, to acknowledge. "I needed the gearbox to keep Wade's glider in the air, and Mama needed a loom to work. That Benny cow could have used it for kindling. "We raised you better than this," Papa snapped. "What's happened to you?" Robin scowled at him, summoning her most fearsome frown. It made all those junior to Robin in the shipyards cower. It just made Papa match it, though, and he'd had several decades more experience with the expression than she. War, she snarled, when she realized he wouldn't be able to outglower him today. She turned on her heel to go up to her room and to bed. Funny how hauling glider pieces and ammunition around never tired her out, but this argument, day after day, always did. She was exhausted, and it had very little to do with how much sleep she'd gotten. Why did nobody believe in her? Captain Wade Perwink was a tall, broad across the shoulders, narrow in the hips, and had a fancy little mustache that was sparse and slightly paler than his sandy-colored hair. Like most of the pilots, Bene to the last of them, he treated his Sealy mid-flight sergeant with respect and courtesy while in the air, but would never be caught eating at the same table or engaging in any sort of social niceties outside of the workplace. Which was why it was quite remarkable when, the next morning, as Robin produced the stolen gearbox from her satchel, Wade threw his arms around her shoulders and kissed her square on the temple, right over her bruise. More green than purple today, thank the gods. Robin laughed and pushed back to keep him from strangling her with his hug. But he squeezed tighter and cried, No, I am never letting you go, you marvelous, resourceful genius, you. Then he contradicted himself by stepping far enough back to get a good look at the gearbox squashed between their stomachs. It wasn't in tip-top shape, but the gears themselves were intact, and that's all that mattered. The rest could either be fixed or replaced. Wade's face glowed with the sort of shining pride that was usually reserved for the fathers of newborns. It's a bit of a mess, he said teasingly, running his calloused fingers over the rust patches that marred the dented outer casing. Omens, Wade, Robin said. You know me better than that. Wade wrinkled his nose at the expletive. The Bene didn't believe in omens. Their goddess never gave away hints. But his smile remained in place. So you'll have it done in time for the general to come inspect our glider at noon? Instead of answering, Robin just rolled her eyes at him. They'll pick you, Wade. If this mission is as important as the scuttlebutt suggests, then they'll want their best pilot on it. We have the best glider, and you're the best pilot. They'll pick you. And I have the best mid-flight, he said, thumping her once on the shoulder with a scarred, meaty hand. Wade's palms were a spider web of puffed scar tissue from the time he'd spent in the air, hands wrapped around the nodal grips on the glider's control stick. Robin accepted the compliment and the gesture for what they were. Conciliatory. Though I nearly didn't. This is nice, by the way, he said, tapping the side of his thumb against her temple, right over the bruise. I'm here now, aren't I? You need to watch yourself, Wade said softly. Fran's father is high in the chain of command. He started it, Robin protested. And you finished it, I know, but Robin... He hesitated, licked his lips, and then plunged on. The mission means too much to me, to us, to both of our careers, to lose it over a fist fight and a bit of rough language. Robin bit off. Exactly so, Wade said. It's even more risky than how you get these. He tapped the tip of one finger against the gearbox. Are you even well enough to go up tomorrow? I can see out of it just fine, Robin protested, and it'll be even better by then. I never said I didn't think you could fly the mission, he assured her, ducking down to inspect the damage. Robin was never quite sure if he knew how flirtatious he sounded when he complimented her, or if he knew the way his eyes twinkled when he looked at her so seriously. Robin tried to swallow her heart, which had tried to crawl up out of her throat, the traitorous thing. Just think about me, will you, when you're slinging your fists around next time? Sure, Robin said with an affected shrug. People worry I do nothing but give you too much thought. Or more. Nosy prigs, she thought. Thanks, he said, and with a final pat on her shoulder and a hungry look at the gearbox, he returned to his pre-flight check of the glider. Dismissed, Robin made her way to the repair bay. Al had promised to get the fire going strong inside the smithy, and to have a hammer ready for the long morning of banging it would take to get the intake back into shape. There was one advantage to having a master corporal as her best friend. He could get all the little forged drones to swarm in exactly the right way to make her life easier. Mind on the bellowing heat of the morning, of sweat that awaited her, Robin looked to the sky and lifted her hands. She held her palms up so the gods could hear her and thought, the things I do to fly. Might just be easier to spend all my energy on trying to sprout some wings. Al was good to his word, as usual, and there was a forge ready and red with heat waiting for her when she got to the smithy. Al was glaring off a few of the other mid-flights, who were trying to sweet-talk him into letting them at the prepared anvil and tongs. Nope, this is for Sergeant Arianhod, she heard him say as she got close. Omens, Al, one of the boys snarled. He was a skinny, muscled thing that Robin vaguely remembered from primary school. He stuck his chin out at Al. Why don't you just give her some flowers like a regular guy? Come on, man, she's out there with her captain. Who knows how long they might be at that? It'll be ages before she arrives. The rest of us have repairs to do. Don't you tell lies about Sergeant Arianhod. Al snapped at him. She ain't that kind of girl. True, Robin agreed as she came up beside the other mid-flight and spoke directly into his ear. He jumped and whirled to face her, dark eyes comically huge in his wide-boned face. And it ain't like that between me and Al, neither. Besides, a ready forge is a better thing for a master corporal to give a mid-flight sergeant any day. Thanks, Al. She grinned at him and patted his shoulder as she walked by, setting the satchel with the gearbox down beside the anvil. She waved to an apprentice, who immediately scampered over with a bucket of cool water, scattering the other mid-flights who had crowded around the no longer free workspace. Hey, anything for you, Robin, Al said and patted her shoulder back. How about sheet of steel, then, if you're offering anything, Robin asked, hands occupied with laying the chain out. Sure thing, he said, and turned to fetch just that. Wiping away the sweat that had already begun to accumulate on her forehead, Robin picked up the heated tongs and got to work. And that's it for Chapter 2. The next video, Chapter 3.
Give up when you're down. Fly as long as you can.